The morning of March 18, 1943, began much like any other training day at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley stood watching as his dive bomber trainees climbed into their SBD Dauntless aircraft, the very same planes that had shifted the balance at Midway only 9 months before. Yet something about the numbers didn't sit right with him. Over the previous 6 weeks, Flatley had lost more pilots in training than he had during all his combat operations throughout the Guadalcanal campaign. The trend was unmistakable and terrifying. These weren't rookie errors or mechanical breakdowns. Seasoned aviators, men who had already endured real combat, were flying near-perfect dive-bombing runs straight into the ocean. Reports from other bases told the same grim story. At NAS Corpus Christi, Pensacola, and countless other fields across the nation, dive bomber pilots were dying in ways that defied all tactical logic. They would roll inverted, pull down into their dive, hold the precise 70-degree angle that doctrine demanded, track their targets flawlessly through the bomb site, and then fail to pull up. No distress calls over the radio. No erratic moves hinting at control issues. The aircraft stayed locked in their steep dives past the release point, beyond the safe altitude for recovery, until the laws of physics left no chance of survival. Crash teams would later find the controls undamaged, the engines running flawlessly, the airframes intact, except for the fatal impact. It was as though the pilots had simply blacked out at the worst possible instant. But sleep wasn't the culprit. What occurred inside those cockpits was far more sinister than mere exhaustion. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had been receiving unsettling reports since late 1942, but the full scale of the crisis only became undeniable when entire squadrons began losing pilots to what official documents cautiously described as failure to recover from dive. That tidy phrase concealed a harsher reality no one wanted to acknowledge. The very dive bombing method that had secured victory at Midway was now killing the men who had perfected it. The same discipline and precision that made it devastatingly accurate against Japanese carriers had created a deadly physiological trap that human biology couldn't escape. Commander Flatley started sharing notes with other training officers, and a disturbing pattern took shape. The casualties weren't reckless flyers or careless newcomers. They were the most disciplined, by-the-book professionals in the fleet. They were the ones who held their dives until the final heartbeat to guarantee accuracy, who had absorbed the harsh mathematics of their craft. Every 100 feet of extra altitude at bomb release could translate into dozens of feet of error on the target. Against a moving warship, that error could mean the difference between a direct hit and a wasted bomb. So these pilots drilled themselves to wait, to stay in the dive, keeping the target perfectly framed in their sights until the very last possible second. That discipline, that relentless pursuit of precision, was killing them in such numbers it threatened to ground the entire dive bomber force. What nobody had properly considered was the toll on the human body when a 2-ton aircraft transitioned from a 70-degree dive at 300 miles per hour into a recovery arc. The math was simple, the physiology was not. When a pilot pulled back on the stick to recover, he wasn't merely changing the aircraft's trajectory. He was subjecting his circulatory system to forces it was never designed to endure. At the bottom of a typical dive recovery, the body experienced between 5 and 7 Gs, meaning that blood suddenly weighed 5 to 7 times its normal weight. That blood, obeying pure physics, drained from the brain and collected in the lower body and legs. The sequence unfolded faster than any conscious reaction. First came the loss of peripheral vision, what aviators called gray out. The outer edges of sight would fade into a dull fog as the retinas, deprived of oxygen-rich blood, began to shut down from the edges inward. This occurred around 4 Gs, giving the pilot perhaps 2 seconds of warning. Then came tunnel vision. Only the center of the view remained, narrowing to a small circle that made reading instruments nearly impossible. At about 5.5 Gs, most pilots would suffer complete blackout, vision gone, yet consciousness technically intact. Beyond 6 Gs, even awareness would vanish. The brain, receiving barely a third of its normal blood supply, would shut down to preserve itself. And that was the fatal paradox of dive bombing. The entire pullout took only 4 to 6 seconds from start to level flight, but G-induced blackout could strike in less than 2, with total unconsciousness in under 4. The timing was disastrous. A pilot would begin the pullout, feel the G-forces build, sense his vision fading, and then lose consciousness precisely when he needed control most. The stick would slacken. The recovery would stop mid-arc, and the aircraft would continue plunging into the sea, guided only by gravity and the inert body of its unconscious pilot. Even worse, when the G-forces finally eased, whether because the aircraft entered a fatal spiral or simply struck the ocean, consciousness would sometimes return in that last fleeting instant, giving the pilot just enough awareness to realize he was about to die. The Navy's Bureau of Medicine began investigating the issue at the centrifuge facility in Pensacola, where volunteer pilots were subjected to the same G-profiles recorded during real dive bombing recoveries. The findings were deeply unsettling. When subjects were warned in advance that heavy G-forces were imminent and instructed to tense their leg and abdominal muscles, a technique known to delay blackout by a second or two, they could remain conscious through pullouts that would otherwise have rendered them unconscious. But in actual combat training, during those final desperate seconds of a dive with the target racing upward, their focus locked entirely on keeping the bomb site's pipper centered. Pilots rarely remembered to perform the anti-G strain. Their minds were simply overwhelmed by the task at hand. By the moment they began the pullout, it was already too late to prepare their bodies for what followed. The Germans had confronted this very problem 4 years earlier, and their response was as harsh as it was ingenious. In 1939, during the Ju-87 Stuka's combat trials over Poland, the Luftwaffe lost 7 aircraft in a single week to mysterious dive accidents. Pilots who had flown flawlessly in training were plowing straight into Polish fields with their bombs still attached. The inquiry revealed that skilled aviators were blacking out during recoveries at rates that made the Stuka almost unusable in combat. But unlike the Americans who would encounter the same nightmare years later, the Germans had an engineer named Hans Ulrich Rudel working closely with Juncker's design teams, and Rudel pressed for a fix that eliminated the human factor entirely. By early 1940, every new Stuka coming off the line featured an automatic pull-out system. The design was remarkably straightforward. Before starting a dive, the pilot would preset a recovery altitude on a barometric switch, and when the aircraft reached that height, pneumatic actuators automatically yanked the control column back, no matter what the pilot was doing. Even if he was unconscious, even if he had completely released the stick, the aircraft would still recover on its own. There was a manual override, a large red lever that restored control, but it required a conscious pilot to pull it. If the flyer had blacked out, the system would save him without any action on his part. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Within 3 months of its introduction, Stuka losses from dive accidents had fallen by more than 80%. Pilots reported feeling the stick wrench backward during pullouts they barely remembered starting. Some recalled waking to find their planes flying level again with no memory of the preceding few seconds. The automatic device produced another unexpected advantage. It allowed pilots to extend their dives longer. Knowing the aircraft would recover automatically at a set altitude, they could keep the bomb site fixed on target through those final critical moments without worrying about when to begin pulling out. They could focus entirely on precision, trusting the mechanism to bring them home alive. Yet when American intelligence officers examined captured Stukas in North Africa in 1941 and 1942, they dismissed the automatic pullout feature as yet another case of German over-engineering. Within the American aviation establishment, there existed a deep mistrust of automation. Pilots were expected to fly their machines themselves, not rely on mechanical systems to do it for them. The dominant belief was that well-trained aviators shouldn't require such devices to prevent blackouts. They simply needed to be better pilots. That philosophy persisted even as accident reports continued to mount. When Navy test pilots evaluated a captured Ju-87 at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in December 1942, their written assessment mentioned the automatic pull-out mechanism but dismissed it as a crutch for underqualified flyers rather than a response to a genuine physiological limitation. That judgment would cost American lives for the next 8 months until hard evidence forced a doctrinal change. The USS Yorktown's Air Group 3 had earned a reputation for precision. These were not rookies straight from training school. They were combat veterans hardened in the Solomons campaign, men capable of dropping a 1,000-pound bomb onto a destroyer's deck from 10,000 feet. Yet on March 26, 1943, during what should have been a routine exercise off the Florida coast, Lieutenant Robert Chen never pulled out of his dive. His wingman, Ensign Marcus Webb, watched helplessly as Chen's Dauntless maintained its angle past the release point, past the altitude where recovery should have started, until it slammed into the sea in a near-vertical impact that left little to salvage. Chen became the squadron's third fatality in 2 weeks, and not the last. 5 days later, Lieutenant William Stamper entered his dive during the very same training run. His radio remained silent. His plane remained perfectly on course. Crew members aboard the Yorktown watched through their binoculars as Stamper's SBD continued its dive past every altitude marker, waiting for the pullout that never came. The moment of impact sent up a towering column of white water visible from miles away. Stamper had once been Chen's instructor. He'd fought through the carrier battles at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz. He had logged more than 300 carrier landings, and now he was dead, killed during a training routine he could have completed half asleep. When the squadron returned to the Yorktown later that afternoon, the commanding officer immediately grounded the entire dive bomber division pending investigation. Admiral Mark Mitcher, then commanding the fast carrier task forces, had seen enough to act. He ordered the Bureau of Aeronautics to stop treating the crashes as random mishaps and start addressing them as a widespread crisis. The inquiry that followed collected every available report from Navy and Marine dive bomber squadrons in both the Pacific and Atlantic theaters. The data was shocking. Between November 1942 and April 1943, the Navy lost 47 dive bomber pilots in training accidents caused by failed recoveries, more than had been lost to enemy fire in that same time frame. Combat squadrons were now reporting that 15 to 20% of pilots suffered at least partial blackout during actual dive attacks, and several missions had ended in chaos when section leaders lost consciousness mid-dive, forcing their wingmen to abandon bombing runs and escort them home. The Bureau convened an emergency conference at Anacostia Naval Air Station, bringing together flight surgeons, aircraft engineers, squadron leaders, and pilots who had survived blackout incidents. For 3 days in early April, they analyzed every assumption they had about dive bombing tactics. Test pilots carried out monitored dives with medical sensors strapped to their bodies, recording changes in pulse, blood pressure, and oxygen levels during the dive and recovery phases. High-speed cameras in chase planes captured the precise instant when a pilot's head slumped forward or his hand slipped from the stick. The findings were undeniable. The standard dive bombing profile, as taught in every naval flight school, was physically unsustainable. Pilots were being trained to execute a maneuver that human physiology simply could not handle for long. Doctrine would have to change, but no one on that panel could agree on how to do it without losing the pinpoint accuracy that made dive bombing so effective. The breakthrough finally came from an unexpected source, not from an admiral or a flight surgeon, but from a young lieutenant junior grade named Thomas Riley, who had been flying off the USS Enterprise since Midway. Riley had quietly begun experimenting with something that defied nearly every established principle of dive bombing, and he hadn't told anyone because he feared disciplinary action. Instead of initiating his pullout at the standard 2,500 feet and releasing his bomb during the early part of the recovery arc, Riley held his dives longer, down to 2,000 feet. Sometimes even 1,800, and released at a point where the aircraft was nearly vertical. Then he eased into a shallower recovery that spread the G-load over more time. The method was completely backward according to the manual. Doctrine said to release early to maximize recovery altitude, but Riley's accuracy scores were inexplicably superior to anyone else's in his unit, and he had never experienced even a brief grayout. When he finally explained his approach at the Anacostia meeting, the reaction was instant skepticism. A Bureau of Aeronautics commander flatly accused him of lying about his release altitudes, insisting no pilot could achieve consistent hits from below 2,000 feet. The bomb sight data didn't even include computations for releases that low. But Riley had gun camera footage, and when the panel reviewed it, what they saw challenged everything they thought they knew about bombing precision. His bombs were striking within a circular error probable of just 35 feet, far better than the 65-foot CEP that was already considered exceptional for dive bombing. And the reason became clear when the aerodynamicists ran the math. The conventional method required bomb release early in the pull-out arc, when the aircraft was climbing through roughly 60 degrees of dive angle. At that point, the bomb carried considerable horizontal velocity that had to be compensated for, and wind drift played a major role. The trajectory formed a complex parabolic path, forcing the pilot to anticipate target movement and correct for multiple variables. Riley's ultra-low releases, however, occurred when the plane was still almost straight down, between 75 and 85 degrees. At that altitude, the bomb fell nearly vertically with minimal forward motion. Wind influence was negligible. The bomb's path was essentially a straight line from release to impact. It was a simpler ballistic solution, and that simplicity produced better accuracy. The bomb sight formulas that seemed off for low-level releases turned out to be entirely correct. They had simply never been tested in that flight envelope because the manuals insisted any pilot who dove that low wouldn't live to report the results. The G-force advantage was just as critical. By holding his dive longer and easing out more gradually, Riley distributed the same total G-load across 7 or 8 seconds instead of compressing it into 4. The peak forces dropped to around 4.5 Gs rather than the typical 6 or 7, keeping him well below the blackout limit. More importantly, the slower onset allowed his cardiovascular system time to adjust. His blood pressure could stabilize, and he could sustain his anti-G strain throughout the maneuver without being overwhelmed by a sudden surge. The technique required courage. It meant diving deeper into the danger zone before initiating recovery, yet the physics left no room for argument. Lower, smoother pullouts were not only safer but also more accurate than the official procedures that were claiming pilots' lives every week. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics had been studying bomb trajectories in wind tunnels since 1941, but no one had applied that research to ultra-low releases until Riley's approach forced a complete re-evaluation. When NACA engineers at Langley Research Center ran new aerodynamic models, they discovered something that should have been self-evident, but had been buried under decades of standard doctrine. The traditional 2,500-foot release altitude had never been selected for precision. It had been chosen for safety. It provided the pilot with maximum margin to recover if something went wrong. But that margin assumed pilots stayed fully conscious through the entire pullout, an assumption now proven false. The wind tunnel data explained why lower releases produced tighter impact groups. A bomb dropped from 2,500 feet during the recovery phase traveled roughly 180 feet horizontally before hitting its target, and in that time it was exposed to wind drift, changing air density, and turbulence from the aircraft's wake. Tiny differences in release timing, just 1/10 of a second, could translate into errors of 15 or 20 feet on the target. But a bomb released from 7,800 feet while still nearly vertical traveled only about 40 feet horizontally before impact. The shorter flight path simplified the trajectory, and the margin of error shrank dramatically. Timing variations that caused significant misses at higher altitudes produced almost no deviation when released lower. Combat footage provided the proof. The Navy had been collecting gun camera film from every mission since Midway, and those reels contained frame-by-frame records of thousands of bomb drops with visible impact points. When analysts reviewed the footage focusing on release altitude and accuracy, the pattern was undeniable. Pilots releasing below 2,000 feet, whether by design like Riley or by simply holding their dives too long, achieved impact groupings roughly 40% tighter than those releasing at the doctrinal 2,500 feet. The very lowest releases, between 1,600 and 1,900 feet, produced accuracies close to what had previously been possible only in slower glide bombing attacks. The G-force profiles told the rest of the story. Using accelerometers mounted in test aircraft, engineers charted the precise G-loading curves for pullouts at different starting altitudes. A recovery beginning at 2,500 feet demanded maximum back pressure almost instantly. The pilot was already running short on altitude and had to arrest the dive immediately. That sharp recovery produced the 6 to 7 G spike responsible for most blackouts. But a pullout initiated at 1,800 feet could be smoother precisely because it began from a more vertical position, allowing a longer recovery arc. Instead of yanking the stick back, the pilot could apply steady back pressure and level out gradually over a longer path. The altitude change was achieved with gentler forces. Peak loads stayed under 5 Gs, comfortably within the limits where pilots could remain fully conscious and operational. Altering doctrine was one matter. Retraining an entire aviation force to do the opposite of what had been drilled into them for years was another. In June 1943, the Navy established a new experimental dive bombing program at Naval Air Station Jacksonville under Commander Flatley's direct command. The syllabus was rewritten from the ground up around what they called the delayed pullout method, though pilots soon nicknamed it riding the edge, or simply the late pull. The first obstacle was psychological, convincing seasoned aviators that descending closer to the water before recovery wasn't reckless, but in fact the safer choice. Training began with classroom sessions that felt more like physics lectures than flight briefings. Pilots sat through detailed presentations on G-induced loss of consciousness, complete with charts mapping blood flow changes under high G loads and graphs linking the rate of onset to blackout risk. Flight surgeons described in exact detail what happened to a pilot's eyes and vision as the retinas lost their oxygen supply. The instructors made certain that every pilot understood this training wasn't about bravery or talent. It was about biology. Even the boldest, most skilled pilot alive would still lose consciousness at 6 Gs if he pulled back too sharply or too fast. The objective wasn't to overpower the G-forces, but to control them, to stretch their effect over time so the body could adapt rather than collapse. Then came the instrument training. The new method demanded that pilots trust their altimeters even when every instinct screamed at them to pull up immediately. Instructors had them drill in linked trainers, early flight simulators, where they repeatedly practiced dive profiles while calling out their altitudes aloud. Passing 3,000, holding angle. Passing 2,500, holding angle. Passing 2,000, sight picture steady. 1,800, initiating pullout. The constant verbal repetition kept their minds engaged and prevented the loss of altitude awareness caused by tunnel vision. They practiced until the callouts became instinctive, a steady rhythm that persisted even under stress. Real flight training then introduced the technique step by step. The first sessions involved practice dives without bomb loads, starting pullouts at 2,200 feet, only a few hundred lower than the previous standard. Instructors flew close in chase planes, giving constant altitude reports over the radio. Pilots learned to recognize what 1,800 feet looked like, how large the target appeared, how the horizon lined up, the precise sight picture that meant it was time to begin recovery. They practiced the smooth pullout, learning to apply consistent back pressure instead of an abrupt jerk on the stick. They rehearsed anti-G straining, starting before the pullout and continuing throughout the recovery arc. Each breath was a grunt, each muscle tensed in the legs and abdomen to keep blood in the upper body. By August 1943, the Jacksonville School was producing pilots who could routinely release between 1,700 and 1,900 feet, achieving circular error probables under 40 feet with 0 G-induced blackouts. The training took about 3 weeks longer than the old program, but the outcome was undeniable. Squadrons receiving these new graduates saw bombing accuracy increase between 35% and 50% compared to those still using earlier methods. Even more importantly, training accidents nearly disappeared. The fear, however, remained. Diving to 1,800 feet before recovery demanded every bit of discipline a pilot possessed. But at least now, they were surviving. The system worked, and the Navy needed to standardize it across every carrier air group in both oceans before the next major campaign. The delayed pullout technique faced its first true test during Operation Forager, the invasion of the Marianas. In June 1944, Task Force 58 deployed 15 fleet carriers into the Philippine Sea, and every dive bomber squadron had been retrained in the new doctrine during the previous 8 months. On June 19th, During what would later be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, American dive bomber crews faced their moment of truth. Japanese carriers launched enormous counterstrikes that overwhelmed American air control units, and the call went out for dive bombers to abandon ship attacks and intercept incoming Japanese strike groups before they reached the fleet. What followed was a test of precision unlike any before it. Lieutenant Commander James Ramage led Bombing Squadron 10 from the Enterprise against a formation of Japanese carrier bombers at 12,000 feet, an altitude once thought far too high for effective dive bombing. Using the delayed pull-out technique, his squadron plunged from high altitude, cutting directly through the center of the Japanese formation, releasing bombs at altitudes below 2,000 feet while traveling at speeds over 280 knots. The results were devastating. Post-action analysis credited VB-10 with destroying or crippling 23 Japanese aircraft in a single attack run, accuracy levels that would have been unthinkable under the old high-release doctrine. Ramage's own bomb struck a Kate torpedo plane so precisely that the explosion scattered fragments across nearly a quarter-mile of ocean. Not a single pilot in his squadron reported even a trace of blackout during recovery. The data from the Marianas campaign told the entire story. Dive bomber units employing the delayed pull-out method achieved hit percentages of 32% against maneuvering warships, compared to the usual 18 to 22% recorded in earlier engagements. During the carrier strikes on June 20th, bombs released below 2,000 feet accounted for 14 of the 18 direct hits credited to American dive bombers. The Japanese carrier Hiyo was struck 3 times in quick succession by VB-2 pilots who all released between 1,800 and 1,850 feet, each bomb driving through the flight deck with such precision that 2 of them penetrated the same elevator shaft. The carriers sank within hours, and post-war examination of the wreck showed impact points clustered within a 50-foot radius, accuracy that would have been unimaginable just a year and a half before. Pilot survival statistics showed equally striking progress. In the 6 months after the Navy adopted delayed pull-out training, incidents of G-induced loss of consciousness dropped by 91% across carrier air groups. Fatal dive accidents became almost non-existent, fewer than 1 pilot per 1,000 sorties, compared with 15 per 1,000 during the grim months of early 1943. The new method had completely resolved the blackout problem, but it had also done something even more profound. It redefined what dive bombing could achieve. The ability to release with precision from extremely low altitudes meant dive bombers could now strike targets that once required entire squadrons. A single plane could destroy a destroyer. 2 aircraft could cripple a cruiser. By the time the Okinawa campaign began in April 1945, the delayed pullout had become so deeply ingrained in Navy doctrine that new aviators arriving from flight school didn't even realize there had ever been another way. They had been trained from their first practice dives to ride their descents down to 1,800 feet, and the older high-altitude techniques now seemed clumsy and inaccurate by comparison. Final statistics from the Pacific War confirmed the transformation. Dive bombers trained under the delayed pull-out system sank or damaged 47% more enemy vessels per sortie than squadrons that had used pre-1943 procedures. They did so with fewer losses, higher survival rates, and an accuracy that turned dive bombing from a blunt tactic into a precision science. What had once seemed a suicidal maneuver in 1943 had become the benchmark against which all other bombing methods were judged. The pilots who had learned to trust physics instead of fear, who forced themselves to hold those screaming dives just a few seconds longer than instinct allowed, had forever rewritten the laws of naval aviation.